Testing her confident husband went wrong, and now she deeply regrets it. When I hired a beautiful actress named Delilah to seduce my devoted husband of 9 years because I couldn't shake my paranoid suspicions, I thought I was protecting myself from potential heartbreak, but when I watched him gently reject her advances while speaking lovingly about me to a complete stranger, and then discovered the divorce papers he'd already prepared because my constant accusations had finally broken his spirit, I knew my jealousy had destroyed the only man who had ever truly loved me unconditionally. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. The mahogany floors of our Victorian home in Willowbrook gleamed under the afternoon sunlight streaming through the bay windows as I sat frozen in my husband's study, staring at the legal documents that would dissolve our marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent months orchestrating an elaborate test to prove Ethan's infidelity, only to discover that while he had remained completely faithful, I had become the one guilty of betrayal. My betrayal of trust, of love, of the sacred bond we had built together over nearly a decade of marriage. Before we dive into this devastating journey of how my own insecurities became the weapon that destroyed my perfect marriage, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below, and if this story of regret and hard-learned lessons resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we have an even more shocking tale of how assumptions can cost us everything we hold dear. If you like the story of our channel, please like the channel, and if you are interested in these stories, join our channel membership. Thank you. The confession letter from Delilah Martinez, the actress I had hired through a discreet agency in downtown Ravensshire, lay crumpled beside the divorce papers. Her words haunted me with their stark honesty. Mrs. Blackthorne, I must tell you that your husband passed every test with flying colors. When I approached him at Meridian Cafe as planned, he immediately mentioned you with such genuine love and pride that I felt ashamed of my role in this deception. He spoke about your smile, your kindness, how you were probably at home working on your latest novel, and how lucky he felt to have found someone who understood his passion for environmental law. When I suggested we meet for drinks, he politely declined, saying he was happily married to his best friend and wouldn't dream of disrespecting that relationship. Mrs. Blackthorne, in my 3 years of conducting these tests for suspicious spouses, I have never encountered a man so genuinely devoted to his wife. I cannot in good conscience accept payment for this assignment, as I believe you should know that your husband's love for you is absolutely authentic. 3 months. 3 months of elaborate planning, secret phone calls, and carefully orchestrated encounters had led to this moment of crushing realization. While I had been consumed with proving Ethan's potential infidelity, he had been meeting with divorce attorneys, not because he wanted to leave me for another woman, but because my constant suspicions, surprise visits to his office, demands to check his phone, and accusations about his late nights working pro bono environmental cases had convinced him that I no longer trusted or loved him. The investigation had started so reasonably, or so I had convinced myself. Ethan's law firm, Greenfield and Associates, had been handling a series of high-profile environmental protection cases that required extensive travel to the northern forests of Ashwood County. He would be gone for days at a time, staying in remote cabins with minimal cell phone service, working with scientists and park rangers to build cases against companies illegally dumping in protected watersheds. When he returned, he would be energized, passionate about the work, speaking animatedly about pristine lakes and endangered species, and the brilliant female marine biologist, Dr. Cassandra Wells, who was serving as their expert witness. Dr. Wells. Even now, her name felt like a knife in my chest, not because she had stolen my husband, but because I had been so foolishly convinced that she had. Beautiful, brilliant, accomplished Dr. Cassandra Wells with her PhD from Ocean View University, and her groundbreaking research on aquatic ecosystems. She was everything I had imagined Ethan might want instead of me, a struggling novelist who had been working on the same manuscript for 2 years while supporting our household with freelance editing work. My paranoia had grown like a cancer over the summer months. When Ethan mentioned Dr. Wells's insights during dinner conversations, I heard romantic interest rather than professional admiration. When he worked late to prepare legal briefs incorporating her scientific findings, I imagined clandestine meetings rather than professional collaboration. When he returned from field research trips with mud on his boots and stories about midnight water sampling expeditions, I pictured romantic moonlit encounters rather than the environmental detective work he was actually conducting. The breaking point had come in September when Ethan returned from a week-long research trip to Crystal Lake with a small gift, a handmade journal from a local artisan, bound in sustainable bamboo leather. "Dr. Wells mentioned you were a writer," he had said, with genuine excitement, "and when I saw this at the craft fair in Pinecrest Village, I thought it would be perfect for your novel. The artisan uses only eco-friendly materials, and I thought you might appreciate the craftsmanship." Instead of seeing this thoughtful gift as evidence of his love and attention to my interests, I had twisted it into proof of his emotional affair. He was discussing me with Dr. Wells. He was thinking about other women while selecting gifts for his wife. He was sharing intimate details about our life with his attractive colleague. The logical explanation, that professional colleagues occasionally mention their spouses in casual conversation, especially during long working days, never occurred to my suspicious mind. That gift had triggered the decision that would ultimately destroy everything. I contacted Meridian Investigations, a discreet private agency in the business district of Ravensshire, and explained my situation to the owner, Victoria Sterling. I wanted to test my husband's loyalty definitively, to either prove my suspicions correct or put them to rest forever. Victoria recommended their most experienced operative for honey trap assignments, Delilah Martinez, a trained actress who specialized in testing potentially unfaithful spouses. The plan was sophisticated and thorough. Delilah would approach Ethan at locations where he frequently spent time, his favorite coffee shop, the bookstore where he browsed legal journals, the farmer's market where he bought our weekly groceries. She would engage him in conversation, express interest in his work, and gradually escalate to more personal interactions. If he was susceptible to infidelity, she would provide multiple opportunities for him to cross lines. If he remained faithful, we would have definitive proof of his loyalty. What I hadn't anticipated was that during the 2 weeks Delilah spent conducting this test, Ethan would misinterpret my emotional distance and erratic behavior as evidence that I was planning to leave him. While I was orchestrating elaborate scenarios to test his faithfulness, he was consulting with attorneys about how to protect my financial interests in a potential divorce, assuming that my coldness and suspicion meant I had fallen out of love with him. The morning I received Delilah's confession letter, Ethan had already been served with preliminary divorce papers that he had filed, not out of desire to end our marriage, but out of desperate hope that forcing a legal separation might shock me into marriage counseling or at least honest conversation about what had gone wrong between us. He had spent our entire 9-year marriage being patient with my insecurities, reassuring me during my darkest moments of self-doubt, celebrating my small writing victories, and supporting my dreams even when my progress seemed glacially slow, and I had repaid his devotion by hiring a beautiful stranger to seduce him. The sound of Ethan's key in the front door echoed through our house like a funeral bell. In a few moments, I would have to face the man I had systematically betrayed while he remained completely faithful to our marriage vows. I would have to explain why I had chosen suspicion over trust, deception over communication, paranoia over love, but first, I needed to understand how I had become the kind of woman who could destroy something beautiful out of fear that it was too good to be true. This story, this devastating tale of self-sabotage and misplaced jealousy, was about to teach me the hardest lesson of my adult life. Sometimes the person you need to test isn't your partner, but yourself. The footsteps approaching the study door belonged to a man who had never given me any reason to doubt his love, and yet I had spent months trying to prove he was capable of betraying me. As those footsteps paused outside the door, I realized that the test had indeed revealed the truth about our marriage, just not the truth I had been expecting to find. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. Alright, let's get back to it. I met Ethan Blackthorne on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening in October 2015 at the annual Willowbrook Literary Festival, back when I still believed that love stories unfolded the way they did in the novels I dreamed of writing. I was 26 years old, clutching a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird and desperately trying to work up the courage to approach the guest speaker, a distinguished environmental lawyer who had just delivered a passionate speech about using storytelling to advocate for environmental justice. The festival was held in the historic Carmichael Theater, its red velvet seats filled with aspiring writers, established authors, and book lovers from across Riverside County. I had driven 2 hours from my tiny apartment in Millbrook just to hear Ethan speak about his recent victory in a landmark case protecting the Silverstone River from industrial pollution. What I hadn't expected was to be completely captivated. Not just by his legal expertise, but by the way he spoke about the power of narrative to change hearts and minds. Every environmental case is really a story, Ethan had told the audience, his deep voice carrying easily through the theater. It's the story of a community that deserves clean water, or a forest that has stood for centuries, or wildlife that can't speak for themselves. As lawyers, we're not just arguing legal precedents, we're telling stories that help people understand why these places and creatures matter. During the Q&A session, I had somehow found the courage to stand up and ask him about the role of fiction in environmental advocacy. My voice shook as I spoke, but Ethan listened with complete attention, his warm brown eyes focused on my face as if my question was the most important thing he'd heard all evening. Fiction has a unique power to help people feel what facts alone can't convey, he answered thoughtfully. When someone reads about a character they care about dealing with polluted water or disappearing forests, they understand the human cost in a way that statistics never could. Are you a writer? That simple question, asked with genuine interest rather than polite conversation, changed the trajectory of my entire life. After his presentation, Ethan sought me out in the lobby where I was browsing the book tables, trying to work up the courage to introduce myself properly. He appeared beside me while I was examining a collection of nature essays, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the festival's concession stand. You look like you could use some caffeine, he said with a smile that transformed his serious courtroom demeanor into something warm and approachable. I was hoping you might tell me more about your writing. Your question about fiction and advocacy was the most insightful one I've heard in months. We talked until the theater staff began turning off lights and stacking chairs. Ethan told me about growing up in the mountains of Ashwood County, where his grandfather had taught him to fish in pristine alpine lakes that were now threatened by mining operations. I shared my dreams of writing novels that mattered, stories that could make people care about issues beyond their immediate experience. I've been working on a novel about a small town fighting to save their local wetlands, I admitted, surprised by how easy it was to talk to him about dreams I usually kept private. But I'm struggling with making the environmental science accessible without dumbing it down. I'd love to read it sometime, Ethan said, and something in his tone suggested he actually meant it. I spend my days buried in legal briefs and scientific reports. It would be refreshing to see environmental issues explored through character and story. That conversation led to coffee the following week at Meridian Cafe, the cozy downtown spot that would become our regular meeting place. Ethan brought a stack of environmental impact studies and scientific papers that might help with my novel research, while I brought chapters of my work in progress that I'd never shown anyone before. You have a gift for making complex issues feel personal and urgent, Ethan told me after reading my opening chapters. This character, Sarah, feels real. When she discovers the contamination in her family's well, I felt angry on her behalf. That's exactly the kind of emotional connection that changes minds. Our coffee meetings became regular dates. Ethan would arrive straight from court, still wearing his navy suits but with his tie loosened and his serious expression softening the moment he saw me. He would tell me about his cases, the small towns fighting corporate polluters, the indigenous communities protecting sacred lands, the whistleblowers risking their careers to expose environmental crimes. In return, I would share my latest writing struggles and small victories, like finally crafting a dialogue scene that felt authentic. Or discovering the perfect metaphor to explain groundwater contamination. You see the human story in everything, Ethan observed one evening as we walked along the Willowbrook River after dinner. When you write about environmental issues, you don't just describe the problem, you help people understand why they should care. That's a rare talent. By Christmas, I knew I was falling in love with more than just Ethan's passion for justice and environmental protection. I was falling for his kindness to waitresses and baristas, his habit of stopping to pet every dog we encountered on our walks, the way he listened to my ideas with complete attention even when I was rambling about plot problems or character motivations. Our first real fight happened in February, when I discovered that Ethan had been quietly paying the bill for all our coffee dates and dinners without telling me. As a struggling freelance writer living on rice and beans between editing assignments, I had been carefully budgeting for our dates, assuming we were splitting costs fairly. I wanted you to be able to order whatever you wanted without worrying about money, Ethan explained when I confronted him about it. I know how hard you're working to build your writing career, and I didn't want financial stress to affect our time together. But I want to contribute equally, I protested. I don't want to be some charity case you're supporting out of pity. Ethan pulled me into his arms in the middle of the sidewalk outside my apartment building, not caring who might see us. Elena, he said, using the full version of my name that only he ever used, you contribute more to my life than you could possibly know. You make me see my work differently. You help me remember why environmental protection matters on a human level. You challenge me to be better at communicating with clients and colleagues. This isn't charity, this is me wanting to take care of someone I'm falling in love with. That was the first time either of us said the word love, and hearing it from Ethan's lips while standing in the golden light of the street lamp outside my building felt like the most natural thing in the world. Our engagement 18 months later was perfectly us, not a grand public gesture, but an intimate moment that grew organically from our shared passions. We were camping in Redwood National Park, where Ethan was researching a case involving old-growth logging rights. I had brought my laptop to work on my novel while he conducted interviews with park rangers and environmental scientists. On our last evening, we hiked to a secluded grove where 1,000-year-old trees created a natural cathedral. As we sat on a fallen log watching the sunset filter through the ancient branches, Ethan pulled out a ring that took my breath away, not because of its size or expense, but because of its perfect simplicity. The band was made from recycled gold. And the stone was a small but brilliant diamond that had been ethically sourced from a Canadian mine. Elena Rodriguez, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, you've taught me that the best stories are the ones we write together. Will you marry me and help me tell the story of a lifetime? I said yes before he finished the question, not just because I loved him desperately, but because I could see our entire future stretching ahead of us like a perfectly plotted novel, full of adventure, purpose, and the kind of deep partnership that makes everything more meaningful. Our wedding in June 2017 was a celebration of everything we believed in. We held the ceremony at Riverside Gardens, a sustainable venue powered by solar energy and surrounded by native plants that supported local wildlife. Instead of traditional flowers, we used potted herbs that guests could take home and plant in their gardens. Our wedding favors were packets of wildflower seeds native to our region, with cards explaining how each variety supported pollinators and local ecosystems. Ethan wrote his own vows, and I still remembered every word. Elena, you've shown me that love and purpose aren't separate things, they're the same force that drives us to protect what matters most. I promise to support your dreams, challenge your ideas, celebrate your victories, and hold your hand through every plot twist life throws our way. I promise to be your first reader, your biggest advocate, and your partner in building a story worth telling. The first 3 years of our marriage felt like living inside a perfectly crafted novel where every chapter built toward greater happiness and deeper connection. We bought our Victorian house in Willowbrook, spending weekends painting rooms and planting a garden that attracted butterflies and songbirds. Ethan converted the sunroom into a writing studio for me, installing built-in bookshelves and a window seat where I could work while overlooking our garden. I finished my first novel during our second year of marriage, with Ethan serving as my first reader and most honest critic. When Riverkeeper's Daughter was accepted for publication by Thornfield Press, Ethan threw a surprise party in our backyard, inviting all our friends and family to celebrate what he called the birth of Elena's literary career. To my brilliant wife, he toasted, raising a glass of champagne as our loved ones gathered under the string lights he'd hung between our maple trees, who proves every day that the right story, told with enough heart, can change the world. We supported each other's careers with the kind of seamless partnership that made other couples envious. I attended Ethan's court proceedings when he argued particularly important cases, taking notes that helped me understand the legal strategies he employed to protect vulnerable ecosystems. He read every draft of my second novel, offering insights about environmental law and policy that strengthened my storytelling. We traveled together whenever possible to research locations for my novels and sites for his cases. We spent a magical week in the Olympic Peninsula, where I gathered material for my third book while Ethan met with tribal leaders fighting to protect their ancestral fishing grounds. We explored the desert Southwest, where ancient petroglyphs inspired my writing while Ethan documented water rights violations affecting indigenous communities. Our dinner parties became legendary among our circle of friends. Environmental lawyers, fellow writers, scientists, and activists would gather around our dining room table for evenings that blended serious discussion about climate change and environmental justice with laughter and storytelling. Ethan would cook elaborate meals using vegetables from our garden, while I curated guest lists that sparked fascinating conversations between people who might never have met otherwise. "You two have created something special here," our friend Daniel Martinez observed one evening as we cleaned up after hosting a group that included a marine biologist, a nature photographer, 2 environmental journalists, and a composer who wrote music inspired by bird songs. "This house feels like a salon where important ideas get born." He was right. Our home had become a place where Ethan's legal expertise intersected with my storytelling instincts and the passionate commitment of friends who shared our values. We were building more than a marriage, we were creating a community of people working to protect the natural world through their various talents and skills. By our 5th anniversary, Ethan had been promoted to senior partner at Greenfield and Associates, while I had established myself as a respected voice in environmental fiction. We owned our dream home, had a circle of friends who shared our values, and seemed to be perfectly positioned to start the family we'd been discussing since our engagement. "We're living our best life," I told Ethan one Sunday morning as we drank coffee in our garden, surrounded by the butterflies and birds our native plants attracted. "Everything we dreamed about when we were falling in love, it's all come true." "Even better than we dreamed," Ethan agreed, pulling me close on our garden bench. "Because we built it together." I had no idea that within 18 months, my own insecurities and paranoid jealousy would begin dismantling everything we had created with such care and intention. The perfect life we had built together was about to become the foundation for the most devastating mistake of my adult life. The first crack in our perfect foundation appeared on a humid Thursday evening in July 2022, though at the time it seemed like nothing more than professional excitement from my husband. Ethan burst through our front door with an energy I hadn't seen since his early courtroom victories, his briefcase abandoned by the entrance as he searched for me throughout our house. "Elena! Where are you? I have incredible news." His voice echoed through the halls with boyish enthusiasm that made me smile as I emerged from my writing studio, where I'd been struggling with a particularly difficult chapter about corporate water contamination. "The Ashwood County case just got 10 times bigger," he announced, pulling me into a spinning embrace that lifted my feet off the hardwood floor. "We're not just fighting titanium industries anymore, we've uncovered evidence of systematic pollution affecting 3 entire watersheds. This could be the environmental case of the decade." I should have been thrilled for him. This was exactly the kind of high-impact litigation that Ethan had dreamed about since law school, the opportunity to protect thousands of acres of pristine wilderness and the communities that depended on clean water. But something in his manner, a particular brightness in his eyes, an almost manic excitement, struck me as different from his usual professional satisfaction. "That's wonderful, honey," I said, studying his face as he paced our living room, too energized to sit still. "Tell me about the new evidence." "It's all thanks to Dr. Cassandra Wells," Ethan said, and I noticed how he lingered slightly on her name, as if it tasted particularly pleasant on his tongue. "She's the marine biologist we brought in as an expert witness for the original case. But her preliminary water analysis revealed contamination patterns that suggest Titanium Industries has been illegally dumping for years, not months." Dr. Wells. I filed the name away in my memory, though I couldn't explain why it immediately made me uncomfortable. Ethan frequently worked with expert witnesses, scientists, engineers, environmental consultants who provided technical expertise for his cases. He'd never shown this level of excitement about a professional collaboration before. "She sounds very thorough," I said carefully, watching as Ethan finally settled into his favorite armchair, though his leg continued bouncing with restless energy. "Brilliant, actually. PhD from Ocean View University, published researcher in aquatic toxicology, and she has this incredible ability to explain complex scientific concepts in ways that juries can understand. When she describes how mercury contamination moves through the food chain, it's like listening to a master storyteller." A master storyteller. The phrase stung more than it should have. Ethan had always praised my ability to make complex environmental issues accessible through fiction, but now he was applying the same admiring language to describe another woman's talents. "Will you be working closely with her on the expanded case?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casually interested rather than suspicious. "Extensively. The case timeline has accelerated significantly. Titanium Industries is trying to rush through a settlement before the full scope of their violations becomes public. Dr. Wells and I will probably be spending the next several months conducting field research, collecting water samples, interviewing affected residents, and building the scientific foundation for our legal arguments." Several months. Field research. Just the two of them, presumably, camping in remote locations with minimal supervision or oversight. The rational part of my mind recognized this as standard procedure for environmental cases, but a smaller, darker voice whispered that it sounded remarkably like an extended romantic getaway disguised as professional obligation. Over the following weeks, I began noticing changes in Ethan's routine that individually seemed innocent but collectively formed a pattern that worried me. He started leaving earlier for work, explaining that Dr. Wells preferred to begin their field research at dawn when water conditions were optimal for sample collection. He returned later in the evenings, often with mud on his boots and stories about challenging sample sites that required hiking through difficult terrain. "You should see some of the places we've been exploring," Ethan would tell me over dinner, his eyes bright with the same enthusiasm I'd once associated exclusively with our conversations about environmental fiction. "There's this hidden waterfall in the northern part of Ashwood County where Dr. Wells discovered an entirely new species of freshwater algae. She thinks it might be a key indicator species for mercury contamination." Dr. Wells thought this. Dr. Wells discovered that. Dr. Wells had suggested a new approach to water sampling that was revolutionizing their data collection. Every conversation seemed to feature the brilliant insights of the mysterious marine biologist who was apparently transforming Ethan's understanding of environmental science. When I suggested joining them for one of their research trips, partly out of genuine interest in seeing the locations that might inspire my next novel, and partly to meet this remarkable Dr. Wells in person, Ethan's reaction was oddly defensive. "The research sites are pretty remote and physically demanding," he said quickly. "Some of the water collection points require rappelling down cliff faces or wading through swamp areas that aren't really suitable for civilians. Plus, our presence needs to be minimally invasive to avoid contaminating the sample sites." civilians. As if I were some random tourist rather than his wife of 5 years who had hiked with him through challenging terrain countless times during our courtship and early marriage. The dismissive term hurt more than his obvious reluctance to include me in this new aspect of his professional life. I began paying closer attention to the details of Ethan's research schedule, noting inconsistencies that probably meant nothing but felt significant to my increasingly suspicious mind. He mentioned collecting water samples at midnight, optimal timing, he explained, when human activity was minimal, but returned home smelling like wood smoke and wearing clothes that seemed remarkably clean for someone who'd been crawling through marshlands in the dark. His phone, which had always been casually accessible, suddenly required passwords and face-down placement during our conversations. When I asked about the new security measures, Ethan explained that Dr. Wells had insisted on confidentiality protocols to protect their research data from potential corporate espionage. Titanium Industries has been trying to infiltrate our investigation, he said, which sounded perfectly reasonable until I noticed that he changed his phone password 3 times in 2 weeks, hardly standard procedure for protecting scientific data. The most troubling change was in our physical intimacy. Ethan had always been an affectionate husband, reaching for my hand during movies, pulling me close while we cooked dinner together, initiating romantic encounters with the same enthusiasm he brought to environmental advocacy. But suddenly he seemed distracted during our intimate moments, as if his mind were elsewhere even when his body was present. "Are you okay?" I asked one night after a particularly disconnected encounter. "You seem like you're thinking about something else." "Just case stress," Ethan replied, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. The Ashwood County research is more complex than we initially anticipated. Dr. Wells is pushing for aggressive data collection timelines that require a lot of mental preparation. Dr. Wells again. Even in our bedroom, apparently, her influence was present. I started researching Dr. Cassandra Wells online, telling myself it was natural curiosity about my husband's important professional collaborator. Her university biography described her as a leading expert in freshwater contamination, with particular expertise in mercury bioaccumulation and aquatic ecosystem restoration. The accompanying photograph showed a woman in her early 30s with intelligent green eyes, auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of natural beauty that didn't require makeup or styling to be striking. She was exactly the type of woman I'd always secretly worried might appeal to Ethan: brilliant, passionate about environmental protection, professionally accomplished, and young enough to make my 33 years feel ancient. Her research publications covered topics that aligned perfectly with Ethan's legal specialty, creating natural opportunities for deep professional conversations about subjects I could never fully understand despite my environmental fiction writing. When I mentioned Dr. Wells's impressive credentials to Ethan, hoping to gauge his reaction, his response was more enthusiastic than I'd expected. "She's revolutionizing the field of aquatic toxicology," he said with obvious admiration. Her research methodology combines traditional water chemistry analysis with innovative biological monitoring techniques that provide much more comprehensive data about ecosystem health. "She's teaching me to see contamination patterns I never would have noticed using purely legal approaches." She was teaching him. The phrase rankled in ways I couldn't articulate. Ethan was a senior partner at a prestigious environmental law firm, a recognized expert in his field with over a decade of courtroom experience. The idea that he needed teaching from anyone, particularly an attractive younger woman, challenged assumptions about our relationship dynamic that I hadn't realized. I'd been making .by September. Ethan's work schedule had become completely unpredictable. Research trips that were supposed to last one day stretched into weekend expeditions. Evening meetings about case strategy turned into dinner appointments that lasted until midnight. When I asked for more specific information about his schedule, so I could plan my own work around his availability, Ethan's explanations became increasingly vague. "Dr. Wells sets the research agenda based on optimal environmental conditions," he would say. "Water sampling has to happen when weather and seasonal factors align properly. It's not the kind of work that follows a traditional business schedule. The rational explanation made perfect sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan was being deliberately evasive about the details of his collaboration with Dr. Wells. When I pressed for more specific information, which research sites they were visiting, what hotels they stayed at during overnight trips, whether other team members were involved in the fieldwork, Ethan's responses became defensive. "Elena, why are you interrogating me about my work schedule?" he asked one evening when I'd requested too many details about an upcoming 3-day research expedition. "You've never shown this level of interest in the logistical aspects of my cases before. Do you not trust me to manage my professional obligations responsibly?" The question hit like a physical blow because it forced me to confront what I'd been carefully avoiding. I was losing trust in my husband, not because of anything concrete he'd done, but because of the accumulated weight of small changes that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. "Of course I trust you," I lied, because admitting my growing suspicions felt like crossing a line from reasonable concern into paranoid jealousy. "I'm just interested in your work. This case seems much more demanding than your usual environmental litigation." "It is more demanding," Ethan agreed, his tone softening slightly. "But it's also more important. The research Dr. Wells and I are conducting could set precedents for environmental protection that last for decades. I know I've been distracted lately, but this case could define my entire career legacy." His career legacy. Not our shared future or family dreams, but his individual professional achievement. The subtle shift in language reinforced my growing sense that Ethan was beginning to see his life in terms that didn't automatically include me as a central figure. That night, lying in bed beside my husband who seemed emotionally absent even when physically present, I made the decision that would ultimately destroy everything we had built together. I would find a way to test Ethan's loyalty definitively, to either prove my suspicions unfounded or confirm that my marriage was already over. The irony, which I wouldn't understand until much later, was that my growing paranoia about Dr. Wells was creating exactly the kind of emotional distance and relationship stress that could drive a faithful husband to question whether his wife still loved him. While I was looking for evidence of Ethan's potential infidelity, I was systematically dismantling the trust and intimacy that had always been the foundation of our marriage. But suspicion, once planted, grows like an invasive species, choking out rational thought and healthy communication until it dominates the entire ecosystem of a relationship. By October, I was no longer capable of seeing my husband's professional dedication as anything other than evidence of romantic betrayal, and I began planning the tests that would ultimately prove I had become the greatest threat to my own happiness. The moment that shattered my carefully constructed reality came on a frost-covered Monday morning in late October, when I decided to surprise Ethan with lunch at his office and discovered something that confirmed my worst fears, or so I believed. At the time, I had spent the weekend wrestling with mounting suspicions about his relationship with Dr. Wells, unable to concentrate on my writing as scenarios of betrayal played endlessly through my mind like a broken record. The morning had started normally enough. Ethan left for work at his usual time, kissing my forehead and mentioning that he'd be reviewing laboratory reports with the research team. I'd planned to use the day for a productive writing session, but found myself staring at a blank document. My creative energy consumed by anxiety about what my husband might be doing with his brilliant, beautiful colleague. By 11 a.m., I'd convinced myself that surprising him with homemade lunch would be a loving gesture that might also provide insight into his current professional situation. I prepared his favorite meal, grilled salmon with quinoa and roasted vegetables, and drove to the downtown offices of Greenfield and Associates with what I told myself were purely romantic intentions. The law firm occupied the top 3 floors of the Riverside Tower, its glass walls offering panoramic views of the Willowbrook River and the forested hills beyond. I'd visited Ethan's office countless times over our 5 years of marriage, always welcomed warmly by the receptionist and secretaries who knew me as the supportive wife who occasionally brought coffee and pastries for the hardworking legal team. But that morning, something felt different the moment I stepped off the elevator. Patricia Kendall, the senior receptionist who usually greeted me with maternal warmth, looked distinctly uncomfortable when she saw me approaching with my insulated lunch bag. "Mrs. Blackthorne," she said, her voice carrying an odd note of caution. "What a lovely surprise. Is Ethan expecting you?" "No, I wanted to surprise him with lunch," I replied, noting how Patricia's eyes darted toward the hallway leading to the partners' offices. "Is he in his office?" Patricia hesitated for a moment too long before answering. "He's in a meeting with Dr. Wells and the research team. They've been working since early this morning on some urgent case developments. Perhaps I could let him know you're here?" The way she said Dr. Wells's name, with careful neutrality that felt forced, sent alarm bells ringing through my already suspicious mind. Combined with her suggestion that I wait to be announced rather than simply walking to Ethan's office as I'd always done before, Patricia's behavior felt like confirmation that something inappropriate was happening behind those closed doors. "That's okay," I said, forcing a bright smile. "I'll just pop back to his office and see if they can take a quick break for lunch." Before Patricia could protest, I walked briskly down the familiar hallway, my heart pounding with anticipation and dread. The lunch bag felt increasingly heavy in my hands as I approached Ethan's corner office, its door slightly ajar despite the ongoing meeting. What I heard as I drew closer stopped me cold in the middle of the carpeted hallway: laughter. Rich. Genuine laughter that I recognized as distinctly Ethan's, but with a quality I hadn't heard in months, the kind of unguarded, joyful sound he used to make during our early courtship when everything felt new and exciting. It was accompanied by a woman's voice, melodious and warm, speaking with evident intelligence about technical subjects I couldn't quite follow from my position outside the door. "That's brilliant, Cassandra," I heard Ethan say, using her first name with an intimacy that felt like a knife in my chest. "I never would have thought to approach the data analysis from that angle. You're revolutionizing how I think about environmental impact assessment." "It's just a matter of seeing patterns that others miss," replied the voice I now knew belonged to Dr. Wells. "When you spend enough time in the field, you start noticing correlations that aren't obvious from laboratory data alone. That's why this collaborative approach is so effective. Your legal expertise combined with my scientific methodology creates insights neither of us could achieve independently." The professional nature of their conversation should have reassured me, but the underlying tone of mutual admiration and intellectual excitement felt more intimate than any of the discussions Ethan and I had shared in recent months. They were connecting on a level that transcended mere professional cooperation, sharing ideas with the kind of animated enthusiasm that characterized the best conversations in any passionate relationship. I pressed myself against the wall outside his office, knowing I was eavesdropping but unable to walk away from what felt like confirmation of my worst fears. Through the partially open door, I could see portions of Ethan's office, the familiar bookshelves lined with environmental law texts, the window overlooking the river where we'd shared countless lunches during happier times, and the conference table where he apparently now spent his days in intimate collaboration with another woman. "The mercury concentration data from Crystal Lake is particularly concerning," Dr. Wells continued, and I could hear the rustle of papers being moved around the table. "If these readings are accurate, the contamination has reached levels that could affect reproductive success in multiple fish species. We need to expand our sampling area to include the entire watershed system." "How long would that take?" Ethan asked, his voice containing the kind of focused attention he used to reserve exclusively for our private conversations about my writing projects. "At least 6 weeks of intensive field work," Dr. Wells replied. "We'd need to camp at remote sites to access some of the more pristine reference locations. It would mean extended periods away from civilization, but the data we could collect would be invaluable for the case." Extended periods away from civilization. Camping together in remote locations. The professional justification was perfectly reasonable, but to my suspicious mind, it sounded like a romantic adventure disguised as scientific research. I imagined them sharing tents and campfires, working side by side under starlit skies, bonding over their shared passion for environmental protection while I remained home alone, struggling with writer's block and growing certainty that my marriage was disintegrating. That timeline could work perfectly, Ethan said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. The court schedule allows for an extended discovery period, and having comprehensive watershed data would strengthen our case significantly. When could we start? Next week, if you're available, Dr. Wells replied. I've already identified the optimal sampling sites and obtained the necessary permits for research in protected areas. We'd start with the northern tributaries and work our way downstream, collecting both water samples and biological specimens at each location. The casual way they planned weeks of intimate collaboration, discussing logistics and timelines as if my existence were irrelevant to Ethan's schedule, felt like the final confirmation of my suspicions. My husband was planning extended romantic getaways with his beautiful colleague while maintaining the pretense that this was purely professional. Obligationed, I backed away from the door, no longer able to bear hearing more details about their planned adventures together. The lunch bag slipped from my numb fingers, the containers inside clattering against each other with sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet hallway. I scrambled to collect the scattered items, desperate to escape before anyone discovered me eavesdropping on their private meeting. Did you hear something? I heard Dr. Wells ask from inside the office. Probably just building maintenance, Ethan replied dismissively. These old buildings are full of random noises. Where were we discussing the sampling protocol for deep water sites? His casual dismissal of the sounds I'd made, his complete lack of curiosity about potential interruptions, felt like another small betrayal. The Ethan I'd married would have investigated any unusual noise, would have been alert to the possibility that his wife might be visiting his office. This new version of my husband was so absorbed in his collaboration with Dr. Wells that he couldn't be bothered to check whether someone might need his attention. I managed to reach the elevator without encountering anyone else from the law firm, though I could feel Patricia's concerned gaze following me as I passed the reception desk. The lunch I'd prepared with such care remained abandoned in my car as I drove home through the autumn landscape, tears blurring my vision of the brilliant foliage that had always brought me joy during my favorite season. By the time I reached our Victorian house, the shock of what I'd overheard had crystallized into something harder and more dangerous, absolute certainty that my husband was conducting an emotional affair with Dr. Cassandra Wells, and quite possibly a physical one as well. The professional collaboration was clearly a cover for romantic involvement, and their planned research expeditions were opportunities for extended intimate encounters away from the constraints of their normal lives. That evening, when Ethan returned home with mud on his boots and stories about productive meetings with the research team, I listened to his explanations with new ears. Every mention of Dr. Wells felt like a deliberate lie, every detail about their upcoming fieldwork sounded like poorly disguised plans for romantic adventure. When he described the excitement of breakthrough discoveries in their contamination research, I heard the enthusiasm of a man falling in love with someone who shared his professional passions in ways his novelist wife never could. You seem distracted tonight, Ethan observed as we sat in our living room after dinner, him reviewing legal documents while I pretended to read a novel. Is everything okay with your writing project? The question felt like mockery. How could I focus on fictional stories when my real life was falling apart? How could I care about imaginary characters when my husband was planning to spend weeks alone in the wilderness with the woman who was destroying our marriage? I'm fine, I lied. Because confronting him directly about what I'd overheard would require admitting I'd been spying on his professional meetings. Just thinking through some plot complications. Plot complications. If only he knew that the most devastating plot twist in my life was currently unfolding in his law office, orchestrated by a brilliant marine biologist who had apparently succeeded in seducing my environmentally passionate husband with promises of professional collaboration and scientific adventure. That night, lying in bed beside Ethan while he slept peacefully, apparently unburdened by guilt about his developing affair, I made the decision that would ultimately destroy everything we had built together. I would find definitive proof of his infidelity through whatever means necessary, and then I would decide how to proceed with the wreckage of our marriage. I had no way of knowing that the conversation I'd overheard was exactly what it appeared to be: passionate professional collaboration between two dedicated environmental advocates working to protect vulnerable ecosystems. I couldn't see that Ethan's excitement about Dr. Wells's expertise was purely intellectual, or that his eagerness for extended fieldwork reflected his commitment to building the strongest possible case rather than his desire for romantic adventure. That night, lying in bed beside Ethan while he slept peacefully, apparently unburdened by guilt about his developing affair, I made the decision that would ultimately destroy everything we had built together. I would find definitive proof of his infidelity through whatever means necessary, and then I would decide how to proceed with the wreckage of our marriage. I had no way of knowing that the conversation I'd overheard was exactly what it appeared to be: passionate professional collaboration between two dedicated environmental advocates working to protect vulnerable ecosystems. I couldn't see that Ethan's excitement about Dr. Wells's expertise was purely intellectual, or that his eagerness for extended fieldwork reflected his commitment to building the strongest possible case rather than his desire for romantic adventure. Most devastatingly, I failed to recognize that my growing suspicion and emotional distance were creating exactly the kind of relationship problems that could drive a faithful husband to question whether his marriage was worth saving. While I was looking for evidence of Ethan's betrayal, I was systematically betraying the trust and communication that had always been the foundation of our love. The weeks following my discovery at Ethan's office transformed me into someone I no longer recognized. The confident woman who had once believed in the power of honest communication to resolve any relationship challenge disappeared, replaced by a paranoid stranger who spent her days constructing elaborate surveillance strategies and her nights lying awake analyzing every word Ethan spoke for hidden meanings and secret messages. Sleep became impossible. I would lie rigid beside my husband, hyper-aware of every sound he made, every shift in his breathing pattern, every unconscious movement that might suggest he was dreaming about another woman. When Ethan's phone buzzed with late-night text messages, which he claimed were urgent updates from research sites with limited cell service, I would wait until he fell asleep, then carefully lift his device to check for evidence of romantic communication with Dr. Wells. The new password protection on his phone became an insurmountable barrier that confirmed my worst suspicions. Previously, Ethan's phone had been as accessible to me as my own, casually shared for everything from looking up restaurant reviews to showing each other funny social media posts. Now, his device was a locked fortress that he guarded with reflexive protectiveness, always placing it face down during our conversations and taking it with him even when he went to the bathroom. My writing, which had always been my refuge during difficult periods, became impossible. I would sit in my beautiful studio for hours, staring at blank documents while my mind obsessively replayed conversations, analyzed Ethan's behavior patterns, and constructed increasingly elaborate theories about his affair with Dr. Wells. The novel I'd been working on, a story about environmental activists fighting corporate corruption, felt mockingly ironic given my growing certainty that my own husband was corrupting our marriage with professional betrayal. Food lost all appeal. I began surviving on coffee and whatever snacks I could force myself to consume when hunger became physically unbearable. Within 3 weeks, I'd lost enough weight that my clothes hung loosely on my frame, though Ethan seemed too distracted by his research schedule to notice my obvious physical deterioration. The social isolation was perhaps the most devastating aspect of my descent. Friends who called to make plans were met with vague excuses about being busy with writing deadlines. When my mother invited me for our traditional monthly lunch at Riverside Cafe, I canceled at the last minute, claiming illness but actually too emotionally fragile to maintain normal conversation without breaking down completely. "Elena, you sound terrible," my mother said during one of her increasingly concerned phone calls. "Are you sure you're not coming down with something serious? Maybe you should see a doctor." "I'm fine, Mom," I lied, though my voice sounded hollow, even to my own ears. "Just pushing hard to meet a publishing deadline." The lie came so easily that it frightened me. I was becoming someone who could deceive the people who loved me most, someone who preferred isolation to the risk of having to explain why my perfect marriage was disintegrating in slow motion. My paranoia extended beyond Ethan's relationship with Dr. Wells to encompass every aspect of our shared life. I began scrutinizing our financial records, looking for evidence of romantic expenses, restaurant charges that didn't correspond to meals we'd shared, hotel bookings for his research, trips that seemed unnecessarily luxurious, purchases of gifts or jewelry that I'd never received. The legitimate business expenses for environmental research equipment and travel costs to remote sampling sites became, in my suspicious mind, evidence of elaborate romantic adventures funded by our joint bank account, when I discovered charges for camping equipment that Ethan hadn't mentioned purchasing. I convinced myself he was buying gear for extended romantic expeditions with Dr. Wells. The rational explanation, that environmental fieldwork in remote locations required specialized equipment, never occurred to my increasingly irrational thought processes. I started following Ethan's car when he left for work, staying far enough behind to avoid detection while trying to determine whether he was actually going to his law office or meeting Dr. Wells at secret locations. The time and energy I devoted to these surveillance missions was exhausting, but I felt compelled to continue gathering evidence that might finally prove what I already believed to be true. One particularly devastating evening, I followed Ethan to what appeared to be a romantic dinner at Thornfield Restaurant, an upscale establishment in downtown Willowbrook known for intimate dining and couples celebrating special occasions. I parked across the street and watched through the restaurant's large windows as my husband shared a table with a woman whose auburn hair and elegant posture matched Dr. Wells's description perfectly. From my distant vantage point, their body language looked unmistakably romantic. They leaned toward each other across the small table, engaged in animated conversation that frequently triggered laughter from both participants. When the woman reached across the table to touch Ethan's hand while making some point in their discussion, I felt something inside my chest physically crack with the pain of confirmed betrayal. I sat in my car for over 2 hours, watching my husband enjoy what appeared to be a romantic evening with his colleague while tears streamed down my face. The elaborate meal service, the wine they shared, the intimate atmosphere, everything confirmed that their relationship had progressed far beyond professional collaboration into full romantic affair. What I couldn't see from my distant position was that the woman with auburn hair was actually Janet Morrison, a senior environmental attorney from the state capitol who specialized in water rights litigation and had driven 3 hours to consult on the Ashwood County case. Her animated gestures were accompanying explanations of complex legal precedents, and her touch on Ethan's hand had been a supportive response to his frustration about procedural delays in their case timeline, but reality had become irrelevant to my paranoid interpretation of events. I drove home that night absolutely certain that I'd witnessed definitive proof of my husband's affair, though I felt too devastated to confront him directly about what I'd seen. The drinking started as a way to numb the constant anxiety that plagued me from the moment I woke up until I finally passed out each night. A glass of wine with dinner became 2 glasses. 2 glasses became half a bottle consumed while waiting for Ethan to return from his increasingly frequent evening meetings. Half a bottle became entire bottles that helped me survive the hours I spent alone in our house, wondering whether my husband was making love to Dr. Wells in some remote forest cabin while I deteriorated in the home we built together. "Are you feeling okay?" Ethan asked one morning when he found me still in my pajamas at noon, nursing a coffee that was mostly Bailey's Irish cream. "You seem like you might be fighting something." The genuine concern in his voice almost broke me completely. Part of me wanted to collapse into his arms and confess everything, my suspicions, my surveillance, my growing certainty that our marriage was ending. But a stronger part, the paranoid voice that had taken control of my thoughts, interpreted his concern as guilty conscience rather than loving worry. "I'm fine," I said, turning away so he couldn't see the tears that seemed to flow constantly now. "Just tired from working late on the novel." Another lie. I hadn't written a coherent sentence in weeks, though I continued pretending to work in my studio to avoid spending time with Ethan. Being near him had become physically painful, knowing that his thoughts were consumed with another woman while he went through the motions of our domestic routine. My appearance reflected my internal deterioration. I stopped bothering with makeup or styling my hair, wearing the same unwashed clothes for days at a time. Personal hygiene became sporadic. Why maintain attractiveness for a husband who was getting his romantic and physical needs met elsewhere? The woman who had once taken pride in her appearance, who had enjoyed dressing up for date nights and social events, disappeared entirely. The lowest point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon when I found myself sitting on our bathroom floor, holding a bottle of sleeping pills and calculating whether the contents would be enough to end the constant pain of knowing I'd lost the love of my life to a brilliant younger woman who shared his professional passions in ways I never could. The pills scattered across the tile floor when my hands started shaking, the sound of their impact snapping me back to awareness of how far I'd fallen. I wasn't actually suicidal, I was just so exhausted from carrying the weight of betrayal and jealousy that the idea of permanent sleep felt appealing compared to the endless cycle of suspicion and heartbreak that had become my daily existence. I called the crisis hotline that evening, not because I had immediate plans to harm myself, but because I needed someone to remind me that the pain I was experiencing wouldn't last forever. "I feel like I don't exist anymore," I told the patient counselor who answered my call. "My husband is having an affair, and I feel like I'm disappearing while I wait for him to finally leave me for her." Betrayal trauma can make you feel like you're losing your sense of self, the counselor replied gently. "But your identity exists independent of your marriage. You're experiencing intense emotional pain, but you're still the same person with the same inherent worth, regardless of what your husband may or may not be doing." The conversation lasted 45 minutes and probably prevented me from taking more drastic action to end my suffering. But it also crystallized my determination to discover the truth about Ethan's relationship with Dr. Wells, even if that truth ultimately destroyed what remained of our marriage. By November, I had become a ghost haunting my own life. I moved through our house like a specter, present but not truly alive, going through the motions of domestic routine while my spirit slowly died from the poison of accumulated suspicion and assumed betrayal. Ethan's attempts to engage me in conversation were met with monosyllabic responses. His suggestions for date nights or weekend activities were declined with claims of illness or work obligations. "Elena, I'm worried about you," he said one evening after I'd spent the entire day in bed, claiming a migraine that was actually just my standard response to seeing Dr. Wells mentioned in yet another of his case-related phone calls. "Maybe you should talk to someone professional about what you're going through. This level of depression isn't normal, even for writer's block." His suggestion that I needed professional help felt like mockery. How could therapy address problems caused by his infidelity? How could counseling cure the pain of watching my marriage disintegrate while my husband enjoyed romantic adventures with his beautiful colleague? "I don't need therapy," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I just need some space to work through things on my own." Space. What I really needed was proof that would either confirm my suspicions and allow me to end our marriage with dignity, or disprove them completely and restore my shattered peace of mind. The uncertainty was killing me more slowly but just as surely as any terminal illness, and I had become desperate enough to consider methods that my rational mind would never have entertained. That desperation would soon lead me to make the decision that would ultimately destroy everything I had spent 5 years believing was indestructible. Though I would discover too late that the enemy I'd been fighting existed only in my own terrified imagination, the catalyst that pulled me from the depths of my paranoid despair came from the most unexpected source: my neighbor's teenage daughter, Zoe Hartwell, who appeared at my door on a gray December morning carrying a basket of homemade muffins and wearing the kind of concerned expression usually reserved for hospital visits. "Mrs. Blackthorne," she said tentatively when I answered the door in my unwashed pajamas at 11 a.m., "my mom sent these over. She's been worried because she hasn't seen you in your garden lately, and your mail has been piling up in the box." 4 days. I looked past Zoe to see that she was right. Our mailbox was overflowing with unopened envelopes and packages, a visible sign of how completely I'd withdrawn from basic life maintenance. The sight of my neglected responsibilities reflected in a teenager's worried eyes was humbling enough to crack through the fog of self-pity that had consumed me for weeks. That's very thoughtful, I managed, accepting the muffin basket with hands that trembled slightly from too much coffee and too little food. Please tell your mother I appreciate her concern. Are you okay? Zoe asked with the directness that only teenagers can manage. You look really sad, and Mr. Blackthorn seems worried about you too. He asked my dad if we'd noticed whether you've been eating regularly. The revelation that Ethan had been discussing my condition with our neighbors hit me like cold water. Either he was genuinely concerned about my well-being, or he was laying groundwork for public sympathy when he eventually left me for Dr. Wells. My paranoid mind immediately seized on the latter interpretation, but something in Zoe's innocent concern sparked a flicker of the woman I used to be. I've been going through a difficult time, I admitted, which was the most honest thing I'd said to anyone in weeks. But I'm working on getting better. My mom went through something similar when she thought my dad was having an affair, Zoe said with the casual wisdom of someone who'd grown up in a household where emotions were discussed openly. Turns out he was just planning a surprise anniversary party and being weird about keeping secrets. She said the hardest part was not knowing for sure what was real and what was just her imagination making things worse. Her words hit with unexpected force. A surprise anniversary party. Innocent secret keeping that had been misinterpreted as evidence of betrayal. The parallel to my own situation was too obvious to ignore, though my suspicious mind immediately dismissed it as coincidence rather than cautionary tale. After Zoe left, I stood in my kitchen eating her mother's muffins, the first real food I'd consumed in days, and contemplating the possibility that my fears about Ethan and Dr. Wells might be similarly unfounded. But weeks of accumulated paranoia couldn't be dissolved by a teenager's well-meaning story, and by afternoon I had convinced myself that the neighbor's experience was irrelevant to my obviously different situation. That evening, I made a decision that felt like taking control of my life for the first time in months. I would stop suffering in passive uncertainty and take active steps to discover the truth about my marriage. If Ethan was having an affair, I would gather definitive proof and confront him with evidence he couldn't deny. If he was faithful, I would finally have the peace of mind necessary to repair the damage my suspicions had caused to our relationship. I spent the next 2 days researching private investigation services in the Riverside County area, looking for professionals who specialized in marital infidelity cases. The websites I browsed were filled with testimonials from clients who had discovered devastating truths about their spouses, complete with photographic evidence and detailed surveillance reports that had enabled them to proceed with divorce proceedings. Armed with comprehensive documentation of betrayal, but traditional surveillance felt too passive for my current emotional state. I needed something more definitive, more immediate than weeks of following Ethan around and photographing him with Dr. Wells at various research sites. I needed a test that would reveal his true character definitively, forcing him to choose between loyalty to our marriage and temptation from an attractive alternative. The idea came to me while browsing the website for Meridian Investigations, a discreet private agency located in downtown Ravensshire. Among their services was something called fidelity testing, the use of attractive operatives to approach potentially unfaithful spouses in controlled situations designed to reveal their true intentions and moral boundaries. Our experienced professionals create realistic scenarios that test your partner's commitment to your relationship, the website explained. Using carefully planned encounters, we can determine whether your spouse is susceptible to outside romantic interest, providing you with definitive answers about their faithfulness and loyalty. The service promised exactly what I desperately needed: concrete evidence that would either confirm or eliminate my suspicions about Ethan's character. No more wondering, no more analyzing ambiguous interactions, no more torturing myself with uncertainty about whether my marriage was real or merely a comfortable arrangement my husband maintained while pursuing his true romantic interests elsewhere. I called Meridian Investigations the next morning and scheduled a consultation with the agency owner, Victoria Sterling, for that same afternoon. The urgency felt necessary. Every additional day of uncertainty was another day of slow psychological torture that I could no longer endure. Victoria's office occupied the 15th floor of the Ravensshire Financial Centre, its floor-to-ceiling Windows offering panoramic views of the city that had once seemed like the perfect backdrop for my successful marriage. Victoria herself was a woman in her early 50s with silver hair, intelligent gray eyes, and the kind of calm professionalism that suggested she'd handled hundreds of cases similar to mine. "Tell me about your situation," she said, settling behind her mahogany desk while I perched nervously on the edge of a leather chair, still unsure whether hiring a private investigator represented sanity or complete emotional breakdown. I outlined my concerns about Ethan's relationship with Dr. Wells, describing the changes in his behavior, the extended research trips, the increased secrecy about his professional activities, and the growing emotional distance between us. As I spoke, Victoria took notes in a leather portfolio, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timelines and specific incidents. "How long has this been going on?" she asked when I finished my summary. "About 6 months," I replied. "But it's escalated significantly in the past 2 months. He's planning extended field research trips with her, staying overnight at remote locations, and he's become very protective of his phone and schedule." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. These behavioral changes could indicate emotional or physical infidelity, but they could also reflect genuine professional demands, especially in environmental law where fieldwork is often required. "Have you considered direct communication with your husband about your concerns?" The question made me realize how far I'd drifted from normal relationship problem solving. 6 months ago, I would have addressed my concerns with Ethan directly, trusting our communication skills and emotional intimacy to resolve any misunderstandings. But paranoia had convinced me that direct confrontation would only prompt him to become more secretive about his affair. "I'm afraid he'll just lie to me," I admitted. "If he's already involved with Dr. Wells, he's not going to confess just because I ask him directly." "That's understandable," Victoria said with practiced empathy. "Many clients reach out to us when traditional communication has become impossible due to trust issues. Our fidelity testing service is designed to provide definitive answers in situations like yours." She explained how the process worked. Meridian Investigations employed several trained operatives who specialized in approaching potentially unfaithful spouses in realistic social situations. The operative would engage the target in conversation, express interest in getting to know them better, and gradually escalate the interaction to determine whether the person was receptive to romantic or sexual overtures outside their marriage. "Our most experienced operative for this type of assignment is Delilah Martinez," Victoria continued, sliding a professional headshot across her desk. "She's a trained actress with extensive experience in fidelity testing. Delilah can approach your husband in natural settings, his favorite coffee shop, the bookstore he frequents, professional conferences, and gauge his receptivity to outside romantic interest." The photograph showed a stunning woman in her late 20s with dark hair, expressive brown eyes, and the kind of natural beauty that didn't require enhancement to be striking. She was exactly the type of woman who might appeal to a man seeking excitement outside his marriage, young, attractive, and sophisticated enough to engage in intelligent conversation about professional topics. "What happens if he shows interest?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. "Delilah will escalate gradually, suggesting coffee, then dinner, then more intimate encounters, to determine the extent of his willingness to betray his marriage vows," Victoria explained. "We document everything through discreet surveillance, providing you with comprehensive evidence of his responses to romantic temptation." The plan sounded both perfectly logical and completely insane. I would be hiring a beautiful actress to seduce my husband while hidden cameras recorded his responses, creating a controlled experiment designed to test his character under conditions he would never encounter naturally. If he remained faithful, I would finally have proof that my suspicions were unfounded. If he succumbed to temptation, I would have the evidence necessary to end our marriage with dignity rather than continuing to slowly die from uncertainty. "How long does the testing process typically take?" I asked. "Usually 2 to 3 weeks. Victoria replied. Delilah will approach her husband multiple times in different contexts, allowing his responses to develop naturally rather than forcing artificial situations. If he's going to stray, we'll discover it. If he's faithful, you'll have definitive proof of his loyalty. I signed the contract that afternoon, writing a check for $3,000 that represented my last attempt to save my sanity by discovering the truth about my marriage. The rational part of my mind recognized that I was about to test my husband's loyalty through elaborate deception, violating the trust and honesty that had always been fundamental to our relationship. But paranoia had convinced me that those principles were already dead. Killed by Ethan's affair with Dr. Wells. As I drove home from Victoria's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not hope that my marriage would survive, I was already convinced it was doomed, but hope that I would finally know the truth and could begin planning my life accordingly. The uncertainty that had been slowly killing me would be replaced by concrete evidence that would allow me to move forward with whatever came next. I had no way of knowing that the test I was about to orchestrate would reveal truths I wasn't prepared to face, or that my husband's responses to temptation would prove the exact opposite of what I expected to discover. The woman who believed she was protecting herself from further heartbreak was actually setting in motion the events that would destroy the only real love she had ever known. The first phase of Delilah's operation began on a crisp Monday morning. In mid-December, when she positioned herself at Meridian Cafe during Ethan's regular coffee routine. I knew his schedule intimately from years of marriage. He stopped for his usual double espresso and blueberry scone every morning at precisely 7:45 a.m. before heading to his office. What I hadn't anticipated was how torturous it would be to orchestrate my husband's potential seduction while pretending everything was normal at home. Victoria had insisted I maintain complete normalcy during the testing period to avoid arousing Ethan's suspicions. I forced myself to prepare his breakfast, kiss him goodbye at the door, and wish him a productive day at work, all while knowing that a beautiful actress was waiting to approach him with romantic intentions. The cognitive dissonance of playing the loving wife while actively sabotaging my marriage felt like psychological torture. Delilah's first report arrived via encrypted email that same evening, accompanied by discreet surveillance photographs that showed my husband's interaction with the woman I'd hired to tempt him. The images were devastating to view: Ethan talking animatedly with a gorgeous stranger, his body language open and engaged, his expression more animated than it had been during our conversations in recent months. Initial contact successful. Delilah's report began. Subject approached the counter at 7:47 a.m. as predicted. I positioned myself ahead of him in line and created an opportunity for natural interaction by appearing to struggle with the menu options. When I asked for his recommendation, he suggested the seasonal winter blend and mentioned that the blueberry scones were excellent. His demeanor was friendly but appropriately reserved for a married man speaking with a stranger. Appropriately reserved. The phrase should have reassured me, but my paranoid mind focused instead on the photographs showing Ethan's obvious enjoyment of the conversation. He was smiling more genuinely than he had with me in weeks, engaged in the kind of animated discussion that used to characterize our best interactions before Dr. Wells entered our lives. Subject mentioned he was an environmental lawyer working on water contamination cases, the report continued. When I expressed interest in environmental issues, he became notably more engaged, discussing his current research project with obvious passion. He spoke about the importance of protecting watersheds and mentioned working with scientists to build legal cases against corporate polluters. Scientists. Plural. I wondered if Dr. Wells was among the unnamed collaborators Ethan had mentioned to this beautiful stranger, and whether his professional passion was merely a cover for romantic involvement with his research partner. Subject referenced his wife twice during our 15-minute conversation, Delilah noted. When I mentioned being new to the area and looking for writing groups, he suggested I might enjoy the Willowbrook Literary Society because his wife Elena was a novelist who had found their monthly meetings helpful for networking. He spoke about you with obvious affection and pride. Two references to me during a casual conversation with an attractive stranger should have felt reassuring, but I found myself analyzing the context suspiciously. Had Ethan mentioned me defensively? Trying to establish boundaries with a woman who was showing interest? Or had the references been casual enough to suggest he wasn't particularly concerned about maintaining marital loyalty? The second encounter occurred 3 days later at Thornfield Books, the independent bookstore where Ethan browsed legal journals and environmental literature during his lunch breaks. Delilah had positioned herself in the environmental science section, creating another opportunity for natural interaction based on shared professional interests. Subject recognized me immediately and seemed pleased to continue our previous conversation, her report detailed. When I mentioned struggling to understand technical aspects of environmental law for a freelance writing project, he offered to recommend several accessible resources and spent 20 minutes explaining complex legal concepts in layman's terms. 20 minutes. My husband had spent 20 minutes providing personal tutoring to a beautiful stranger, sharing his expertise with the kind of patient enthusiasm he usually reserved for helping me research environmental topics for my novels. The parallel was too obvious and too painful to ignore. Subject's body language remained appropriate throughout the interaction, Delilah continued. He maintained professional distance and redirected the conversation to educational topics rather than personal subjects. When I suggested we continue the discussion over coffee, he politely declined, explaining that he had a busy court schedule and needed to return to his office. He had declined coffee with a beautiful woman who was clearly interested in spending more time with him. This should have been evidence of his faithfulness, proof that my suspicions about his character were unfounded. Instead, I found myself wondering whether his refusal reflected genuine loyalty or merely caution about being seen in public with another woman while his affair with Dr. Wells remained secret. The photographs from this encounter were even more difficult to view than the first set. Ethan looked completely relaxed and happy, engaged in the kind of intellectual discussion that had originally attracted me to him during our courtship. Seeing him share that animated enthusiasm with another woman felt like watching him give away something that belonged exclusively to our relationship. Delilah's third approach occurred the following week at the Riverside Farmers Market, where Ethan shopped for organic produce every Saturday morning. This encounter was designed to be more personal, testing his responses to romantic interest in a social rather than professional context. Subject was selecting vegetables when I approached. With questions about choosing ripe avocados, Delilah reported. He was extremely helpful, explaining how to identify quality produce and recommending vendors who specialized in organic farming. The conversation naturally expanded to include cooking techniques and seasonal recipes. The idea of my husband discussing cooking with another woman triggered a jealousy so intense it felt like physical illness. Food preparation had always been one of our shared domestic pleasures, something we did together while discussing our respective workdays and planning weekend activities. Watching him share that intimate knowledge with a stranger felt like witnessing the theft of sacred marital territory. Subject mentioned planning to cook dinner for his wife using ingredients from the market, Delilah continued. When I commented that she was lucky to have such a thoughtful husband, he smiled and said she deserved much better than he could provide, but that he tried to show his appreciation through small gestures like home-cooked meals. She deserved much better than he could provide. The self-deprecating comment was typical of Ethan's modesty, but hearing it secondhand through Delilah's report felt devastating. Was my husband feeling inadequate in our marriage? Did his comment reflect genuine insecurity about his worthiness as a partner, or was it evidence that he was comparing me unfavorably to Dr. Wells and finding our relationship lacking? When I suggested we exchange contact information so he could send me some of his recipe recommendations, subject politely declined, Delilah noted. He explained that his wife was the better cook and suggested I search for online resources or cooking classes if I wanted to improve my culinary skills. Another deflection that should have reassured me but instead felt like evidence that Ethan was becoming skilled at avoiding romantic entanglements while maintaining plausible deniability. If he was having an affair with Dr. Wells, he would naturally be cautious about additional complications that might expose his infidelity. By the end of December, Delilah had approached Ethan 6 times in various contexts, each encounter designed to test his receptivity to romantic interest from an attractive, intelligent woman who shared his professional passions. Her reports consistently documented the same pattern: initial friendliness followed by appropriate boundaries, references to me that demonstrated his commitment to our marriage, and polite but firm refusal of any suggestions for private meetings or extended personal contact. Subject has shown no indication of romantic interest or willingness to pursue inappropriate contact, Delilah's final assessment concluded. His responses suggest genuine commitment to his marriage and strong personal boundaries regarding relationships with women outside his family. In my professional opinion, this individual is not susceptible to infidelity and would require extreme circumstances to consider betraying his marital vows. Reading her conclusion should have filled me with relief and joy. The test I'd orchestrated had provided definitive proof that my husband was faithful, that my months of suspicion and paranoia had been unfounded, that our marriage was built on the solid foundation of mutual loyalty I'd always believed it to be. Instead, I felt a strange emptiness that I couldn't initially identify. The certainty I'd craved for months was finally mine, but it came with the devastating realization that I had spent half a year systematically destroying my relationship with a man who had never given me any legitimate reason to doubt his devotion. Worse than the wasted months of suspicion was the growing awareness that my behavior during this period had been creating exactly the kind of relationship problems that could drive a faithful husband to question whether his marriage was worth preserving. While I'd been testing Ethan's loyalty through elaborate deception, he had been experiencing my emotional withdrawal, constant suspicion, and increasingly erratic behavior as evidence that I no longer loved or trusted him, the woman who had hired an actress to seduce her husband was about to discover that the greatest threat to her marriage had never been Dr. Cassandra Wells or any other potential romantic rival. The enemy that had been systematically destroying everything she held dear was staring back at her from every mirror in their beautiful Victorian home, and the damage she had inflicted through paranoid jealousy was about to prove far more devastating than any affair could have been. As I sat in my writing studio that evening, surrounded by the remnants of the novel I'd been unable to complete for months, I realized that Delilah's test had revealed truths I wasn't prepared to face about my own character and the kind of wife I had become. The relief I'd expected to feel upon learning of Ethan's faithfulness was overshadowed by the growing certainty that I might have already lost him through my own destructive behavior, and that the love I'd been so desperate to protect had been slowly poisoned by the very measures I'd taken to preserve it. The wake-up call that finally shattered my paranoid delusions came from an unexpected source: a phone call from Dr. Cassandra Wells herself, the woman I'd spent months imagining as the destroyer of my marriage. Her voice was warm and professional when she called our house on a snowy January evening, asking to speak with me rather than Ethan, who was upstairs reviewing case files in his study. "Mrs. Blackthorne, this is Dr. Cassandra Wells from the Ashwood County Research Team," she said. "I hope you don't mind me calling directly, but I wanted to reach out about something important regarding your husband's work on our contamination case." My hands trembled as I gripped the phone, finally hearing the voice of the woman who had occupied my nightmares for months. She sounded older than I'd expected, with the kind of confident professionalism that suggested extensive experience rather than youthful ambition. Nothing in her tone indicated romantic familiarity with my husband. "I'll get Ethan for you," I managed, though my voice sounded strained even to my own ears. "Actually, I was hoping to speak with you first," Dr. Wells said. "Ethan has mentioned your environmental fiction work several times during our research collaboration, and I've been hoping to discuss a potential opportunity that might interest you professionally." She wanted to discuss my writing career. The woman I'd convinced myself was stealing my husband was calling to talk about professional opportunities for me. The cognitive dissonance was so overwhelming that I had to sit down to continue the conversation. "What kind of opportunity?" I asked, though part of me still suspected this was some elaborate manipulation designed to get closer to our family. "I'm Part of a consortium developing educational materials about water contamination for public schools, Dr. Wells explained. We need someone who can translate complex environmental science into engaging narratives that will help students understand the real-world implications of pollution and conservation. Ethan spoke so enthusiastically about your ability to make environmental issues accessible through storytelling that I immediately thought of you for this project. Ethan had been promoting my work to his professional colleagues. He'd been speaking enthusiastically about my writing abilities to the woman I'd imagined as his romantic rival. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, forcing me to confront how completely my paranoid assumptions had distorted reality. He's very supportive of my writing, I said weakly, beginning to understand the magnitude of my misinterpretations. He clearly adores you, Dr. Wells continued with evident warmth. During our long research days, he frequently mentions how much he misses having dinner conversations with you about environmental issues, and how your perspective on storytelling has influenced his approach to presenting legal arguments. I hope you know how lucky you are to have a partner who speaks about you with such obvious love and respect. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Dr. Wells outlining the educational project and explaining how my fiction writing skills could contribute to environmental education initiatives. By the time we hung up, I had accepted a freelance position that would allow me to work from home while contributing to meaningful environmental advocacy, exactly the kind of opportunity I'd dreamed about but been too paranoid to pursue while obsessing over my imaginary marital problems. More importantly, I had spoken with the woman I'd demonized for months and discovered that she was a thoughtful professional who spoke about my husband with collegial respect rather than romantic interest, and who actively wanted to support my career rather than steal my place in Ethan's life. That evening, after Dr. Wells's call, I forced myself to confront the evidence I'd been accumulating about Ethan's alleged affair and examine it with rational rather than paranoid analysis. The extended research trips were documented in court filings and scientific publications. The late-night phone calls corresponded to data collection deadlines and legal briefing schedules. The camping equipment purchases were itemized in environmental research budgets that were publicly available through legal discovery processes. Everything I'd interpreted as evidence of romantic betrayal had alternate explanations that were not only plausible but obviously true to anyone not blinded by jealous paranoia. My husband had been doing exactly what he'd always told me he was doing, working passionately on an important environmental case that required extensive collaboration with scientific experts. The next morning, I made the hardest phone call of my adult life, dialing the number for Dr. Miranda Chin, a therapist who specialized in anxiety disorders and relationship trauma. I had resisted seeking professional help for months, convinced that therapy couldn't address problems caused by my husband's infidelity. Now I understood that the problems requiring treatment were entirely within my own mind. I think I've been experiencing some kind of paranoid episode, I told Dr. Chin during our initial phone consultation. I've spent months convinced my husband was having an affair, but I'm starting to realize that the evidence I thought I was seeing was actually just my own fears and insecurities projected onto innocent professional relationships. Dr. Chen's voice was gentle but direct. Paranoid thoughts about infidelity can be symptoms of underlying anxiety disorders, especially when combined with other stressors. How long have you been experiencing these concerns? About 8 months, I admitted. It started gradually but escalated until I was essentially surveilling my husband and creating elaborate theories about his behavior patterns. That level of persistent suspicion can be extremely damaging to both your mental health and your relationship, Dr. Chin explained. But the fact that you're recognizing these patterns and seeking help suggests that you're ready to begin recovery. Would you like to schedule an in-person appointment to discuss treatment options? My first therapy session took place the following week in Dr. Chen's comfortable office in downtown Willowbrook. The space was designed to promote calm discussion, with soft lighting, comfortable seating, and windows overlooking the river where Ethan and I had taken countless walks during our courtship. Being in that environment helped me begin articulating the fears and insecurities that had nearly destroyed my marriage. Anxiety disorders often manifest as obsessive thoughts about losing the things we value most, Dr. Chin explained after I'd outlined my months of suspicious behavior. Your fears about Ethan's fidelity may have been your mind's way of trying to protect you from potential abandonment, but the protective mechanisms became more dangerous than the threats they were designed to address. She introduced me to cognitive behavioral therapy techniques for managing intrusive thoughts and distinguishing between rational concerns and anxiety-driven paranoia. We practiced mindfulness exercises that helped me stay present in actual conversations with Ethan rather than analyzing his words for hidden meanings or secret messages. Recovery from this kind of episode requires rebuilding trust in your own perceptions, Dr. Chin told me during our third session. You've spent months second-guessing your husband's behavior, but you've also lost confidence in your ability to accurately interpret reality. We need to restore both kinds of trust simultaneously. The therapeutic work was exhausting but necessary. I had to confront not only my unfounded suspicions about Ethan, but also the underlying insecurities about my own worthiness that had made those suspicions feel plausible. Why had I been so ready to believe that my successful, devoted husband would want to replace me with a younger colleague? What fears about my own value had made infidelity seem like an inevitable outcome rather than an unthinkable betrayal of our shared values? Your self-esteem took a significant hit during this period, Dr. Chin observed as we explored these deeper issues. When we don't feel worthy of love, we start looking for evidence that confirms our worst fears about ourselves. The paranoid thoughts about Ethan may have been reflecting your own doubts about whether you deserved his loyalty and affection. Parallel to the therapy work, I began the delicate process of rebuilding my relationship with Ethan without confessing the full extent of my surveillance and testing. I couldn't reveal that I'd hired an actress to seduce him, that betrayal was too profound to confess without destroying whatever trust remained between us. But I could acknowledge my general anxiety and apologize for the emotional distance that had characterized our interactions for months. I know I've been difficult to live with lately, I told him one evening as we attempted to return to our old routine of sharing dinner and discussing our respective work days. I've been struggling with some anxiety issues that made me withdraw from our relationship. I'm getting professional help now, and I want to do whatever it takes to rebuild what we've lost. Ethan's response was more forgiving than I deserved. I've been worried about you for months, he admitted. You seemed so distant and unhappy that I started wondering if you were having second thoughts about our marriage. I even consulted a lawyer about how to protect your financial interests if you decided you wanted a divorce. The revelation that Ethan had been consulting divorce attorneys hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been obsessing over his imaginary affair, he'd been preparing for the possibility that I might leave him. My paranoid behavior had convinced my faithful husband that I no longer loved him, creating exactly the kind of marital crisis I'd been so desperately trying to prevent. I don't want a divorce, I said, reaching across our dining table to take his hand. I want to save our marriage and become the kind of wife who deserves your love and patience. You've always deserved my love, Ethan replied, squeezing my fingers gently. But I've missed feeling like you actually enjoyed my company. For months, it's felt like you could barely tolerate being in the same room with me. His words forced me to confront how my surveillance and suspicion had affected him emotionally. While I'd been convinced he was betraying me with Dr. Wells, Ethan had been experiencing rejection and emotional abandonment from the woman he'd married. My attempts to protect our relationship had been systematically destroying it from within. The rebuilding process required consistent effort and conscious choices about how to interpret Ethan's behavior. When he mentioned working late with Dr. Wells, I practiced responding with interest in his professional achievements rather than suspicion about his personal motivations. When he traveled for research, I focused on supporting his important environmental work rather than imagining romantic scenarios that existed only in my paranoid imagination. Most importantly, I began redirecting the energy I'd been wasting on surveillance and suspicion toward productive activities that restored my sense of purpose and self-worth. The educational writing project Dr. Wells had offered became my first step toward professional recovery, giving me meaningful work that contributed to environmental advocacy while utilizing my specific skills and talents. "You seem like yourself." Again, Ethan observed one evening in late February as we worked together in our kitchen, preparing dinner while discussing the day's developments in his legal case and my progress on the educational materials project. "I've missed this version of you, the confident, creative woman I married who sees possibilities instead of problems." His comment made me realize how much of my identity I'd lost during the months of paranoid obsession. The woman who had once approached challenges with optimism and creativity had been replaced by a suspicious stranger who saw threats and betrayal in every interaction. Recovery meant not only saving my marriage but reclaiming the essential parts of my personality that had attracted Ethan to me in the first place. By spring, our relationship had regained much of its former warmth and intimacy, though I remained acutely aware of how close I'd come to destroying everything through my own destructive behavior. The trust we'd rebuilt was precious and fragile, requiring constant nurturing and conscious appreciation for what we'd almost lost. What I didn't yet understand was that my recovery and our marital healing were about to be tested by a revelation that would prove my paranoid suspicions had been not only wrong, but catastrophically destructive in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. The letter that destroyed everything arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April, delivered by certified mail while Ethan was at his office preparing opening arguments for the Ashwood County trial. I signed for the thick envelope without recognizing the return address, Blackwood & Associates, Legal Services, assuming it was related to one of my freelance writing contracts or the educational materials project I'd been developing with Dr. Wells's consortium. The law firm's letter had meant nothing to me until I read the first paragraph, which made my hands shake so violently that I had to set the pages on our kitchen counter to continue reading. The formal language was devastating in its clinical precision, notice of dissolution proceedings followed by case numbers and legal terminology that gradually assembled into the most horrifying revelation of my adult life. Ethan had filed for divorce 3 months earlier, in January, during the darkest period of my paranoid episode when I'd been completely consumed with surveillance and suspicion. While I'd been orchestrating elaborate tests of his fidelity and convinced myself that he was betraying me with Dr. Wells, my husband had been quietly consulting attorneys and preparing to end our marriage because my behavior had convinced him that I no longer loved him. The divorce papers were dated January 15th, exactly 1 week after I'd hired Delilah Martinez to seduce him, and just 2 days after our most devastating fight about his work schedule with Dr. Wells. I'd accused him of lying about his research timeline, demanded access to his professional communications, and threatened to call Dr. Wells directly to verify his explanations about their collaboration. Ethan had responded with the kind of cold, professional distance I'd never seen from him before, and apparently that conversation had been his breaking point. Petitioner seeks dissolution of marriage due to irreconcilable differences and breakdown of marital communication. The legal documents stated in language that reduced our 9-year relationship to bureaucratic terminology. Respondents' behavior has become increasingly hostile and suspicious, creating an environment of distrust that makes continued cohabitation untenable. Hostile and suspicious. The words felt like physical blows because they accurately described what I'd become during my months of paranoid obsession. While I'd been convinced that Ethan was the problem in our marriage, he'd been documenting my erratic behavior as evidence that our relationship had become irreparable. The financial settlement terms were generous beyond anything I could have expected. Ethan was offering me full ownership of our Victorian house, 70% of our joint savings accounts, and continued health insurance coverage for 2 years following the divorce finalization. He was essentially giving me everything we'd built together while taking only his personal belongings and professional assets. Most devastating was a handwritten note attached to the legal documents, written in Ethan's familiar careful script. "Elena, I've tried to wait for the woman I married to come back, but I can't continue living with someone who clearly believes I'm capable of betraying everything we promised each other. You deserve to be with someone you can trust completely. And I deserve to be trusted by the person I love. Maybe apart we can both find the happiness that seems impossible together." I'll always love the woman you used to be. The note was dated 3 weeks earlier, suggesting that Ethan had been carrying these divorce papers with him for almost a month, waiting for the right moment to serve them, or perhaps hoping that our recent improvements would make them unnecessary. The fact that he'd chosen to send them by certified mail rather than deliver them personally indicated that he'd made peace with ending our marriage and wanted to handle the dissolution as gently as possible. I read through the entire packet twice, absorbing details that painted a comprehensive picture of how thoroughly I'd destroyed my husband's faith in our relationship. The property division was meticulously fair. The custody arrangements for our shared assets showed careful consideration for my financial security, and every aspect of the proposed settlement reflected Ethan's continued care for my well-being. Even as he prepared to remove himself from my life permanently, the most crushing detail was a timeline attached to the legal filing that showed when Ethan had begun consulting with divorce attorneys. His initial appointment was scheduled for December 18th, just 3 days after I'd hired Meridian Investigations to test his fidelity. While Delilah Martinez had been approaching him at coffee shops and bookstores, creating artificial temptations designed to prove his infidelity, Ethan had been meeting with lawyers to discuss how to protect my financial interests when he left me. The irony was so devastating that I actually laughed, a harsh, broken sound that echoed through our empty kitchen. I'd spent $3,000 to prove my husband was unfaithful, only to discover that he'd remained completely loyal while simultaneously planning to divorce me because my suspicious behavior had convinced him that I no longer loved or trusted him. Delilah's testing had taken place during the exact period when Ethan was preparing to end our marriage. Her reports documenting his faithful responses to romantic temptation had been generated while he was actively consulting with attorneys about property division and support arrangements. The man who had passed every test of his marital loyalty with flying colors had already decided that our relationship was beyond salvage. The psychological timeline was even more horrifying than the legal one. In November, I'd hired a private investigator to test Ethan's faithfulness. In December, he'd consulted divorce attorneys because my behavior had convinced him I wanted to end our marriage. In January, I'd been receiving reports proving his loyalty, while he was filing legal documents to dissolve our relationship. In February and March, we'd been rebuilding our emotional intimacy while he carried divorce papers in his briefcase, waiting for the courage to serve them. The woman who had been so proud of our recent reconciliation, who had believed that therapy and honest communication were restoring our marriage, had actually been living in a fantasy. While I'd been celebrating small improvements in our daily interactions, Ethan had been preparing for our permanent separation with the same careful attention to detail he brought to his environmental law cases. I called Dr. Chin immediately, needing professional support to process this devastating revelation without completely falling apart. Her voice was calm and steady when she answered, providing the kind of emotional anchor I desperately needed to avoid spiraling back into the paranoid thinking that had created this crisis. "This feels like confirmation of all your worst fears," Dr. Chin observed after I'd read her the key portions of the divorce filing. "But remember that these documents reflect Ethan's state of mind during the period when your relationship was at its most damaged point. The improvements you've both experienced since then suggest that reconciliation might still be possible." "But he's been carrying these papers for weeks," I protested. "He's been planning to leave me while I thought we were rebuilding our marriage. How is that different from the emotional betrayal I was so afraid of?" "It's different because his motivations were protective rather than selfish," Dr. Chin explained. "These documents show that Ethan was trying to ensure your financial security and handle the dissolution with dignity, not that he was pursuing romantic alternatives. The betrayal you feared was never about infidelity, it was about the breakdown of communication and trust that made both of you feel unloved." Her analysis was logical, but the emotional impact of discovering that my husband had been planning to leave me for months felt like the ultimate confirmation that my paranoid fears had been justified. I'd been right to suspect that our marriage was in danger. I'd just been wrong about the source of the threat. The worst part was understanding that Ethan's decision to file for divorce had been a rational response to my irrational behavior. He hadn't left me for another woman or betrayed our wedding vows. He'd simply reached the reasonable conclusion that a marriage characterized by constant suspicion and hostility wasn't sustainable for either of us. When Ethan came home that evening, he found me sitting at our dining room table with the divorce papers spread across the surface like evidence from a crime scene. His expression when he saw the opened envelope was a mixture of relief and sadness that suggested he'd been dreading this moment for weeks. "I was going to tell you about those tonight," he said quietly, setting down his briefcase and removing his suit jacket with the careful movements of someone preparing for a difficult conversation. "I've been carrying them around for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment to discuss our options." "Our options?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the emotional chaos raging inside me. "It looks like you've already decided what you want." Ethan sat down across from me at the table where we'd shared thousands of meals and conversations during our marriage. The physical distance between us felt symbolic of how far we drifted from the intimate partnership we'd once shared. "I filed those papers during the worst period of our relationship," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "You seemed so angry and suspicious all the time that I convinced myself you were looking for an excuse to leave me. The divorce seemed like a way to give you what I thought you wanted while protecting you financially." The conversation that followed was the most honest we had in over a year, with both of us finally acknowledging the fear and miscommunication that had nearly destroyed our marriage. But even as we talked through our mutual misunderstandings, I knew that I was keeping the most devastating secret of all, the elaborate test I'd orchestrated to prove his infidelity, and how completely wrong I'd been about the nature of the threat to our relationship. Looking back now, 18 months after the moment that nearly destroyed everything, I understand that the choice I faced that April evening in our dining room, surrounded by divorce papers and the wreckage of mutual misunderstanding, would define not only the future of our marriage but the kind of person I would choose to become for the rest of my life. The conversation with Ethan about the divorce filing lasted until nearly midnight, both of us finally speaking with the brutal honesty that our relationship had been missing for over a year. He explained how my months of suspicious behavior had convinced him that I no longer trusted or loved him, while I tried to articulate my fears about Dr. Wells without revealing the full extent of my surveillance and testing. "I know I became someone difficult to live with," I admitted, choosing my words carefully to acknowledge my destructive behavior without confessing its most shameful aspects. "I let my insecurities poison our relationship and made you feel like you couldn't do anything right. I started to believe you wanted me to leave," Ethan replied, his exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "When someone you love treats you like you're capable of betraying them, eventually you start wondering if maybe you should." The conversation ended with an agreement to postpone any legal proceedings for 6 months while we attempted intensive couples counseling. Ethan moved into our guest bedroom temporarily, creating physical space that might allow emotional healing without the pressure of forced intimacy. We would work with Dr. Chin together to address the communication breakdown that had nearly destroyed our marriage, but even as we shook hands on this tentative reconciliation, I knew that our relationship was built on a foundation of secrets that could destroy us completely if they ever came to light. I had betrayed Ethan's trust just as thoroughly as any unfaithful spouse, hiring a beautiful actress to seduce him while he remained completely loyal to our marriage vows. The test that had proven his faithfulness had also proven my willingness to deceive and manipulate the person I claimed to love most. The couple's counseling sessions began the following week, with Dr. Chin facilitating conversations that gradually uncovered the fear and insecurity that had driven both of our destructive behaviors. Ethan spoke about feeling emotionally abandoned by a wife who seemed to suspect his every action, while I tried to explain my terror of losing him without revealing how that terror had led me to violate every principle of trust and honesty that supposedly governed our relationship. "Both of you were operating from fear rather than love," Dr. Chin observed during our 3rd session together. "Elena, your fear of abandonment created behaviors that pushed Ethan away. Ethan, your fear of continued rejection led you to plan an escape rather than fighting for the relationship. Fear became a self-fulfilling prophecy for both of you." The therapeutic work was slow and often painful, requiring us to rebuild basic Communication skills that had been destroyed by months of suspicion and defensiveness. We practiced expressing concerns without accusations, listening without immediately preparing counterarguments, and distinguishing between rational relationship issues and anxiety-driven catastrophizing. Progress came in small increments. Ethan began sharing details about his workday without my automatically analyzing his words for evidence of deception. I started expressing appreciation for his efforts to rebuild our connection rather than treating every gesture with suspicious skepticism. We began eating dinner together again, tentatively rebuilding the domestic intimacy that had once been the foundation of our happiness. The breakthrough came during our 8th counseling session, when Dr. Chen asked us each to describe what we'd learned about ourselves during this crisis period. Ethan spoke about recognizing his tendency to withdraw rather than confront relationship problems directly, acknowledging that filing for divorce had been an avoidance strategy disguised as protective consideration. When my turn came, I felt the weight of the secret I'd been carrying for months pressing against my chest like a physical burden. The actress, the testing, the surveillance, all of it represented betrayals that were potentially more damaging than any affair because they violated the fundamental trust that marriage requires to survive. I learned that I'm capable of becoming someone I don't recognize when I'm afraid, I said, choosing words that hinted at my shame without revealing its full scope. I let fear turn me into a person who could hurt the people I love most, and I'm still working to understand how to prevent that from happening again. Dr. Chin nodded thoughtfully. Recovery from this kind of crisis requires both partners to take responsibility for their contributions to the relationship breakdown, but it also requires absolute honesty moving forward. Secrets and hidden behaviors are incompatible with rebuilding trust. Her words felt like a direct challenge to confess everything about Delilah and the fidelity testing, but I convinced myself that some truths were too destructive to share. Ethan had suffered enough from my paranoid behavior without learning that I'd actually hired someone to seduce him. Some secrets, I rationalized, were better kept buried if they served no constructive purpose. By late summer, we had achieved what felt like a miraculous reconciliation. Ethan withdrew the divorce papers and moved back into our shared bedroom. We planned a second honeymoon to celebrate our renewed commitment, a week in the mountains of Ashwood County, visiting some of the pristine locations where his environmental research had been conducted. The irony of choosing Dr. Wells's research sites for a romantic getaway wasn't lost on me, but it felt symbolically appropriate to reclaim those spaces for our marriage. Our relationship had emerged stronger in many ways from the crisis that had nearly destroyed it. We communicated more directly about concerns and needs, appreciated each other's efforts more consciously, and had developed deeper empathy for the fears and insecurities that could threaten any long-term partnership. The experience had taught us that love alone wasn't sufficient to sustain a marriage. It required ongoing commitment to honesty, trust, and mutual respect. What I didn't anticipate was that the secret I'd chosen to keep would eventually surface in a way that would test our rebuilt relationship more severely than any of the original problems that had driven us apart. The revelation came during a holiday party at Ethan's law firm in December, almost a year after our reconciliation. I was talking with Janet Morrison, the environmental attorney I'd mistaken for Dr. Wells during my paranoid surveillance period, when she mentioned an amusing story about being approached by a private investigator the previous winter. Some poor woman had hired them to test her husband's fidelity. Janet laughed, unaware that she was describing my own desperate actions. Apparently the investigator had approached the wrong target at Thornfield Restaurant. They thought I was the husband's colleague that the wife was suspicious about. When I explained the mix-up, the investigator was mortified. I felt terrible for whoever had been driven to such desperate measures by their own insecurities. The blood drained from my face as I realized that my elaborate testing scheme had been even more misguided than I'd understood. Not only had I hired someone to seduce my faithful husband, but my surveillance had led me to misidentify completely innocent professional dinners as romantic evidence. The paranoid woman who had convinced herself she was protecting her marriage had been operating in a fantasy world of her own creation. Ethan noticed my distress immediately. "Elena, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." That evening, faced with the choice between maintaining my secret and risking the destruction of our rebuilt marriage, or confessing everything and trusting that our renewed love could survive the truth, I chose honesty. I told Ethan about Delilah, about the testing, about every aspect of my paranoid betrayal of his trust and loyalty. His response was the final lesson in the difference between the love I'd feared losing and the love I'd actually found. After the initial shock and hurt, Ethan held me while I cried and apologized for betraying him in ways that went far beyond anything I'd accused him of. Instead of leaving me for my deception, he chose to see it as evidence of how much our relationship meant to me, even when fear had driven me to express that love in destructive ways. "I wish you trusted me enough to talk about your fears instead of testing me," he said as we sat together in our living room, processing this final revelation. "But I understand why you felt like you needed proof rather than promises. The important thing is that we're both choosing honesty now, even when it's difficult." Today, our marriage is stronger than it was before the crisis that nearly destroyed it, not because we survived betrayal but because we learned to survive our own capacity for fear and destructive behavior. We've discovered that the greatest threats to lasting love often come from within ourselves, our insecurities, our assumptions, our willingness to protect our hearts in ways that actually damage them. The test I orchestrated to prove Ethan's faithfulness ultimately proved something far more important, that real love isn't about finding someone who will never hurt or disappoint you, but about choosing to trust and forgive even when fear whispers that protection requires suspicion. My husband remained faithful during the most elaborate temptation I could devise, but more importantly, he remained committed to our marriage even after learning about my most shameful betrayal of his trust. Sometimes the person we most need to test isn't our partner, but ourselves, our capacity for trust, forgiveness, and the kind of love that chooses vulnerability over self-protection. I learned that the hard way, but I learned it in time to save the most important relationship of my life. The woman who had been so afraid of losing her husband's love discovered that she'd been the greatest threat to her own happiness, and that acknowledgement became the foundation for building something real and lasting from the ashes of her paranoid fears. The divorce papers that had once threatened to end our marriage now sit in our safety deposit box as a reminder of how close we came to losing everything, and how much we value what we chose to fight for instead. /parameter/invoke coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.